This video has been sponsored by MUBI. MUBI is an amazing online video streaming service that brings you incredible films from all over the world. Each day there's a new film, but each film is only hosted for 30 days, and that means that there's an ever-changing catalogue of hand-picked films to suit anybody's taste. You can watch them right now on your laptop or take them on the go with a mobile device. And right now you can get a 30-day free trial by heading over to mubi.com/100years. The Caped Crusader, The Dark Knight, the world's greatest detective. You don't need me to explain who the character is. Since his comic book debut in 1939, he's been one of the most recognizable characters not just in comic books, but in all of popular culture. By day, he's a playboy billionaire, but when the night falls, he stalks the dark alleys and strikes fear into the hearts of the criminals of Gotham City. I'm talking, of course, about Batman. Batman made his leap into the silver screen in 1943, and though he wasn't the first superhero to be featured in a movie, his lengthy film career can tell us a lot about the changing state of cinema and cultural trends over the decades. His varying incarnations are a window into the time in which they were created. So let's dive into the live-action films of Batman, finishing up with the end of the Dark Knight trilogy and starting with the weird and wonderful world of the film serial. Hello and welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. We'll be taking a look at least one film each year from 1915 onwards to track the evolution of film over the last century. Batman made his first appearance in Detective Comics #1 way back in 1939, and the character was an immediate hit. Unlike Superman or other early heroes, Batman was dark and mysterious, and he was popular enough that just 1 year later, he earned his own comic book title. And by the early 1940s, almost all of the Batman mythos that we know today had already been established. It was in 1943 that Batman first donned his cape and mask for the cinema camera, though not quite in the way that most people would know him today. Bruce Wayne was still a playboy millionaire whose alter ego fights crime under the mask of a giant bat. He still had his ward and sidekick Robin, and he was still the world's greatest detective and a master of martial arts. Kind of. But due to pressures from the Office of War Information and the Motion Picture Production Code, Batman's tragic backstory was dropped completely. Instead of a vigilante crime fighter, Batman was an undercover agent working for Uncle Sam to help win the war. And in lieu of any of the villains from his extensive rogues gallery, Batman faces off against the Japanese spy known as Dr. Daka. Along with these differences came some innovations that changed the Batman canon forever. For example, the serial gave Batman his iconic Batcave and transformed Alfred from a portly bumbling fool into a slim and integral part of the crime-fighting team. The Batman serial operated pretty much the same way as any other serial for the time. They generally ran between 12 and 15 episodes, around 20 minutes each, and ended with the characters facing a seemingly inescapable problem. The overarching stories tended to be winding and almost meaningless, and mainly served as a vehicle to get the characters into a chase or an adventure. And like all serials and feature films of the time, it was very much a product of its era. A few months earlier, President Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans. Anti-Japanese and pro-internment sentiment is a strong theme running through all the episodes. Here's how a narrator describes Little Tokyo.
This was part of a foreign land transplanted bodily to America and known as Little Tokyo. Since a wise government rounded up the shifty-eyed Japs, it has become virtually a ghost street where only one business survives, eking out a precarious existence on the dimes of curiosity seekers.
This is immediately followed by a salesman reinforcing the importance of paying tax.
Now the price of admission is only 10 cents, plus 1 cent tax per Uncle Sam.
The series received middling reviews from critics who thought that it fell short of other serials at the time, like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. And while it wasn't a complete commercial failure, it didn't do well enough to warrant an immediate sequel. In fact, Columbia would wait until 1949, a year after the hugely successful Superman serial, to produce Batman and Robin, which boasted an even smaller budget, worse special effects, and a much poorer reception from both audiences and critics. For a long time, both Batman serials were dropped from cinemas and almost completely forgotten. That was until 1965, when cinemas started airing An Evening with Batman and Robin. The serials were cut together into a 4.5-hour midnight screening, which delighted counterculture audiences. In the 2 decades since the release of the serial, what was cheap and amateurish had become camp and kitsch, and what was innocent had become imbued with a homoerotic subtext. Students and artists would pack theatres to laugh at the unintentional comedy of the serials. It proved so popular with countercultural audiences that artist Andy Warhol would produce an unauthorized art film, Batman Dracula, which would go on to inspire the aesthetic of Batman throughout the 1960s. The re-release of the serial and the subsequent art house film was a signal that mainstream audiences were ready for their own Batman film, and ABC Studios, hungry for a hit TV show, took inspiration for a program that would take Batman into the swinging 60s. The Batman TV series took the unknowing campiness of the serials and magnified it. Here's how producer William Dozier described the tone of the show. I just had the simple idea of overdoing it, making it so square and serious that adults would find it amusing and kids would go along for the adventure. But just as the TV series would call back to the campy earnestness of the film serial, it was also a reflection of the 1960s. At the time, the Batman of the comic book pages wasn't exactly the brooding vigilante that we know today. Instead, he had taken on a distinctly more comedic tone, and that was reflected in the whimsical nature of the show. Visually, the show existed in a kind of cultural echo chamber. Comic books had influenced the look and feel of 60s pop art, which in turn went on to inspire the art style and visual language of the TV show. This combination of art style and tone proved to be a huge success, and just 2 months after the final episode of the first season, Batman hit the cinema screens in his first feature-length film, Batman the Movie. Batman the Movie both satirizes and amplifies the silly tropes of the serials and comics, and as such, it falls somewhere between a straight adaptation and a parody. But what's important is that it informed the public opinion of the character. For many people, Adam West was Batman, and that's simply the way that the character was. A sequel was planned to the '66 movie, but as the TV show was cancelled after its 3rd season amid dwindling popularity, Batman the Movie 2 was scrapped, and the Caped Crusader wouldn't return to the silver screen for over 2 decades. And when he did, it would be in a distinctly different tone. In 1989, Batman returned to the silver screen under the direction of Tim Burton, who sought to bring the Bat back to his gritty, realistic tone. The 80s saw the release of comic books like The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke, which painted Batman and Bruce Wayne as dark, twisted characters, wrapping him in a moral ambiguity and leaning heavily into the vigilante's psychology. And it was along these lines that Burton planned his own version of Batman. Big-budget superhero films weren't a new thing in 1989, but even 10 years after Richard Donner's Superman, they still weren't taken very seriously. And this is where Batman parted ways with the superhero films that came before it, and also where it left its strongest mark on cinema. Under Tim Burton, Batman brooded. He was dark and menacing. The film was violent. It mixed elements of noir and expressionism, painting Gotham City as something closer to Fritz Lang's Metropolis than any real place. It combined the comical and the serious, the realistic and the fantastic. It reflected the best that comic books had to offer, telling amazing stories without camp or irony. It treated its characters and its world with respect, and in doing so, it separated the idea of Batman from the Adam West interpretation and helped lay the groundwork for the darker, modern superhero movies we see in cinemas today. Along with the mood and look, Burton's masterstroke was in using the character of the Bat to reflect social values. In this case, calling on Cold War hysteria by pitting 2 unstoppable, opposing ideologies against each other and satirically taking on 80s commercialism and excess. The film was a colossal hit, raking in over $40 million in its opening weekend, and immediately Warner Brothers started shopping around for a sequel. Both Burton and Keaton were reluctant to return, but after an increase in both salary and creative control, the two returned to create an even more warped version of Gotham City. Batman Returns followed in the same footsteps as the previous films, only pushing everything just a little bit further. More villains, more elaborate sets, more action set pieces. It upped the social commentary, taking on corrupt politicians and corporate greed. Batman Returns was a distinctly more adult-orientated film, leaning harder into the sex and violence that were common in the graphic novels, and while this may have been truer to the source material, it caused a backlash from parents who wondered why a superhero film needed to be so violent. The backlash was so severe that McDonald's pulled their Happy Meal promotion, and Warner Brothers blamed the violent nature of the film on its disappointing box office returns. For the next Batman film, executives wanted something a little more family-friendly, and the pressure was on to find something that fit neatly between the camp of Adam West and the darkness of Tim Burton. 1999 saw the release of Batman Forever. Burton was replaced by Joel Schumacher, while Val Kilmer donned the cape as Batman. Batman Forever was released at a time when VHS technology had been fully adopted by both audiences and studios. Cinema attendance had been on a gradual decline for decades, and the highest demographic of that year was 14 to 25-year-olds. So Batman Forever was designed specifically to pander to a younger audience. From the opening scenes alone, the tonal shift in the character of Batman is readily apparent. Instead of the dark, expressionistic Gotham, Schumacher presents us with a much more cartoony interpretation of the city, complete with glowing neon lights. The sinister nature of villains like the Penguin or the Joker had been switched out for something a little lighter, Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face and Jim Carrey as the Riddler. Despite its more child-friendly and comical approach, Batman Forever did try to examine the difficulty of reconciling Bruce Wayne with his alter ego, pulling back into Wayne's childhood and exploring the reasons why Bruce chooses to fight crime, though it did end up reducing the character to a goofier and much less serious vigilante. Though the film didn't blow critics away, it was a huge box office success, taking in $53.8 million on its first weekend, and the phenomenal success had Warner Bros. Fast-track a sequel. And if Batman Forever was heavy on cartoon imagery and light on theme, Batman and Robin would head even further in that direction. Batman and Robin is more than just the weakest entry in the Batman franchise, it's widely considered to be one of the worst films ever made. If Tim Burton's Batman was meant to capture the dark tones set out by comic books like The Dark Knight Returns, Batman and Robin moved in totally the opposite direction. According to the actor John Glover, before each take, director Joel Schumacher would take to a microphone and yell, "Remember, this is a cartoon." It makes sense that the Batman of the late 1990s would be lighter in tone. This was a time a huge economic surplus and violent crime had fallen almost 20% since its peak in 1991. There simply wasn't room in the American public psyche for a tortured vigilante hunting down violent criminals in dark alleyways. Instead, Batman took on a much lighter tone, more likely to flash a back credit card than to hold a terrified mugger over the edge of a building. Despite a promising opening weekend that brought in almost $43 million, poor reviews meant that the film was dead in the water. Box office returns were so poor that many feared that we would never see Batman again on the big screen. Throughout the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, there were a number of unsuccessful attempts at resurrecting Batman's film career, including a fifth film in the Burton-Schumacher franchise, a live adaptation of Batman Beyond, and a screened version of the acclaimed Frank Miller graphic novel, Batman Year One. But it wasn't until Warner Bros. Signed Christopher Nolan in 2002 that a viable project began to take shape, and with this, the Caped Crusader would enter the 21st century. After the flop that was Batman and Robin, what was needed was something radically different. Enter the Dark Knight Trilogy, kicking things off with Batman Begins. Batman Begins was a fresh take on the franchise and a total reboot of the character, taking Bruce Wayne right back to the origins of Batman, exploring the formation of his character, his training with the League of Shadows, and the dark psychology behind his need to fight crime. Crucially, it abandoned the campy, childish tone that developed towards the end of the 90s and tried to treat Batman as if he existed in the real world, employing a darker, grimier tone than we had seen in any superhero movie before. One of the reasons that the film resonated with audiences was in its examination of a post-9/11 America and the politics of fear. Fear is shown as the prime motivator for both the criminal and hero elements of Gotham City. Bruce chooses the symbol of a bat, a childhood phobia, to terrify the criminals of Gotham. Falcone uses fear and intimidation to keep his criminal enterprise above the law, and crucially the Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul plot a terrorist attack to instill fear into the citizens of Gotham City, to cause them to destroy themselves and cleanse the earth of their decadence and excess. In his book, War, Politics and Superheroes, Ethics and Propaganda in Comics and Film, scholar Mark DiPaolo writes that Batman Begins is obviously firmly rooted in the present and clearly reflects contemporary anxieties about the destruction of the World Trade Center, the War on Terror, and the invasion of Iraq. Arguably, Batman Begins was the truest representation of the character from the comic books, and it was the highest grossing film to date. Batman was back, and immediately a sequel was put into production. In 2008, The Dark Knight escalated the themes set out by Batman Begins by developing on the idea of terrorism, this time with the Joker planning a series of public bombings and political assassinations. The Joker embodied the American public's fear of terrorists in the year following 9/11, faceless, indiscriminate, and operating seemingly without logic or empathy, striving only to drive America into anarchy and despair. Conversely, Batman takes on the difficult and ambiguous role of the American counter-terrorism agencies. He simultaneously must keep a strict code of ethics, never killing his enemies, and yet he pushes the boundaries of civil liberties by linking every cell phone in Gotham City into a mass surveillance device. In 2012, Batman returned to the screen with the final installment of the Dark Knight Trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises. Once again, Gotham City is menaced by a terrorist threat, this time from Bane, seeking to complete the mission set out by Ra's al Ghul. In a departure from the Joker's anarchic band of terrorism, the third film focuses more on wealth inequality and a rising division between social classes. Bane's attack on Gotham City is the most complete and destructive out of any of the films, and it's in this destruction that Nolan takes the character of Batman to the logical conclusion set out by the first film: Batman as a symbol. At the end of the film, Batman fakes his own death, taking a nuclear weapon out of Gotham, and in doing so, he cements the idea that one must die a hero or live to see yourself become a villain. His death inspires the people of Gotham, restores hope to Commissioner Gordon, and leads a young Robin into becoming his successor. It's in this final interpretation of the character, that of a symbol of hope, that we get the essence of Batman. Whether he's a straight-edge government agent fighting for the war effort, a camp symbol of counterculture, or a stand-in for the war on terror, Batman has always been a symbol for his time. None of these interpretations are more or less correct than the other. What matters is what the audience sees reflected in the character, and that's why he's endured for the past 75 years. Since the closing of the Dark Knight trilogy, there have been several screen interpretations of the Caped Crusader, and thanks to his malleability in reflecting cultural trends, there's likely to be many more. When you watch a Batman film, ask yourself, what is he fighting for, and what does that say about the time the film was made? Do you agree with his methods and his ethic? And if not, what would you like to see reflected in the symbol of the bat? Thanks for watching, my name's Charlie. I glossed over the art house film Batman Dracula from 1964, and that's because the YouTube channel Film Histories has done a great video about it, and you'll find a link to that at the end of this. Let me know what you think. What's your favourite Batman film? For me, I have to go for Batman Returns, but I'm going to give an honourable mention to Batman Mask of the Phantasm by Bruce Timm. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody that supports me on Patreon, including my latest supporter, Nils Wendelbro-Nyer, Ben Heyman, and Danko Bundalo. I also want to thank MUBI for sponsoring this video. MUBI is an incredible streaming site that brings you some of the best films from around the world. They bring you a new film every day, so there's always something interesting to watch. It's a great place to discover new and interesting films, and they do an amazing job of shining a light on spectacular cinema that otherwise might find it hard to find a wider audience. So head over to mubi.com/100years to get yourself a free trial. Check out more of my videos by clicking on the card on the screen right now, watch the Batman Dracula video, subscribe, and click on the Patreon link to help support this channel. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.